Alright, this video is going to go over the American Revolutionary War. Obviously, I'm not going to take a ton of time. This is something you should have learned a little bit about last year. So what I'm going to do is go over some of the major things. If you look at these first three slides here, they have a lot of the major stuff on there. That's kind of just a synopsis of everything. And then we're going to get into it here on slide 6. Your notes, you have spots where you need to fill in a definition and its impact on the war. I'm going to do my best to give you both of those as I go through it. So the first thing that we have here is the French and Indian War, which was fought from 1754 to 1763. This was a war between the French and the Indians versus the British and the colonists. It was won by the British and the colonists. However, what it did is cause a huge war debt. Because of that debt, King George III blamed the colonists, and so he wanted to tax them to recoup a lot of the funds for his war. He had to pay off some other countries, he had to pay off his soldiers and his generals and all of that stuff, and they just didn't have the money to do it. So the king blames the people or the colonists and wants to recoup funds that way. One of the first thing that the king does is pass something called the writs of assistance, and this is just use of general search warrants. It meant that the British army and soldiers or tax collectors could search anyone, anytime, anywhere. The colonists got very angry with this and they protested against this. One of the other things the king did was he issued what we call the Proclamation of 1763. Basically all that is him saying he does not want the colonists to go west of the Appalachian Mountains. So the Appalachian Mountains run right through here. They stop about right here in the Carolinas. This would be present-day Georgia. So basically he says he wants the colonists to stay on this side. The reason for this is that way this land here is reserved for the Native Americans, and if the colonists head west, they'll most likely get into another war that the king's going to have to pay for. He doesn't want to have to pay for that. The Sugar Act of 1764, they already had something called a Molasses Act. The Sugar Act actually lowers the price of sugar from the Molasses Act. However, it becomes a lot more strictly enforced. And as a result of this, what the citizens begin to do, the colonists, they actually start smuggling in tea. So the colonists' reaction to the Sugar Act is to smuggle in tea. Next is George Grenville. George Grenville is the one that came up with that idea, hoping to stop the smuggling of tea, but all the Sugar Act did was just cause people to smuggle in more and more tea. Next was the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act of 1765 put a tax on anything on paper. Wills, licenses, deeds, playing cards, pamphlets, basically anything that had that was on paper required a stamp. If it didn't have this stamp, it could be destroyed. This was just one way that the British was taxing things that the colonists were using so that they could recoup some of the money for the French and Indian War. If you look here, you got the British actions, you have colonial responses. This will help you fill out your paper. Eventually, we're going to end up going through that and getting to war. The Stamp Act, we get something called the Stamp Act Congress. They refused to buy stamps or stamped paper. They just started kind of making their own and making do with whatever they could. Well, the next thing that the British does is they issue the Quartering Act. Quartering means housing. So as a result, the colonists have to house British soldiers. And it wasn't just for one night. It's not like a one-night hotel stay or something like that. In some cases it was, but in many cases it was much longer than that. Days, weeks, months, and the soldiers would, spy on the citizens and, try to get information from them, those types of things. The citizens where they stayed had to give all the supplies for the British soldiers, food, clean their clothes, all of that stuff. The Townshend Acts were next, and this is another ploy by the British to tax things that they are using. So it was a tax on tea, lead, paint, things they used for, everyday items for writing and stuff like that. More steps to the revolution. We're going to add a couple things there. Then we get one of the major events that's most known, and that's the Boston Massacre. And the Boston Massacre is not, the way that we see it, it's not really how it happened. So the image that we see from the Boston Massacre is this right here. And if you look at this picture, it looks like you got British soldiers lined up just firing people, which that's what a massacre would be. But that's not really what happened. What actually happened is you had a crowd of colonists. They began to throw stones, woods, basically anything that they could find. There's reports of them throwing oyster shells, stuff like that. The soldiers get knocked down, and to defend themselves, they actually fire at the crowd. So as a result, this riot was used as propaganda by the colonists. This isn't much different than today when we have riots or the Capitol riot, where people use, things as propaganda and try to get people on one side or the other. So they use this image here, and obviously this isn't an actual depiction of what happened, but they put it out in all the newspapers to try to swing people's decisions or viewpoints in their direction. So the fallout from this is a couple things. One, we are starting to use propaganda in the Revolutionary War. Two, Crispus Attucks is the first person killed in the American Revolutionary War. At least he's credited with that. Interesting fact, he was of African American descent. A couple other interesting things from it is John Adams, who becomes our second president, actually defends the British soldiers, and they get away. They're found to be innocent as a result of self-defense. So kudos to John Adams and his integrity of the law there. All right, so some more things here. As a result of the Boston Massacre, the colonists and founding fathers realized the importance of swaying people's opinions. So we talk about the fact that we have three groups of people. You got patriots, loyalists, and you have the people who are neutral. Well, the Committee of Correspondence job is to get those people that are neutral to join their side. So what they did is they wrote pamphlets and letters that were sent throughout the colonies to stir hatred for the British. So that's what they did. Then we get a few things here that are kind of cause and effect. The British passed the Tea Act, which basically lowers the price of tea below what they were smuggling it in, what the colonists were smuggling it in for. Now, if you equate this to the movie theater and you smuggling stuff into the movie theater, imagine if the movie theater lowered its prices below, what you buy stuff either at Target, Five Below, the convenience store, whatever. They're going to get really upset. So the colonists had to come up with a plan of what to do. So to lower the supply, which means the British would have to increase their price if their supply is lowered, they decide to destroy it. And also they're just a little upset, and they want to be a little bit petty here. So what happens is the Sons of Liberty, led by Sam Adams, leads a group of people dressed up as Native Americans, and they dump all the tea overboard. All right, that forces Britain's hand to pass something called the Intolerable Acts. And all this does is basically grounds Boston. All right, so if you've been grounded before, it's the same type of thing here. You're not allowed out of your room until you do certain stuff. Well, Boston wasn't allowed to conduct business until they cleaned up the harbor. Britain strictly enforced the Quartering Act because they wanted to make sure people were doing, the right thing, and they want anybody that was, seen to be a rebel were soon to be, followed and watched and those types of things. So what the colonists do in return is they set up the First Continental Congress. Now, this is our first real political body that represents our interests. Lots of great people are in there. You got Sam Adams, John Jay, Patrick Henry, George Washington. Lots of important people. What the Congress does is they issue a statement of grievances. Those are things that we think the Parliament, that's the British lawmaking body, we think that they're doing that are violating our rights. So they do that, and then they issue a statement saying they're going to boycott all British goods. All right, so we are moving closer to war, so it becomes important for you to understand who is who. The British soldiers are called the Redcoats. Sometimes they were called lobsterbacks. In the colonies, we have the colonial militia and then the Continental Army. All right, the colonial militia was made up of Minutemen. These are your ordinary, everyday people who have to be ready within a moment's notice. You also have patriots and loyalists. We've talked about those just a little bit ago. The patriots, they want to fight for independence from the king. The loyalists want to remain loyal to the king and Great Britain. Made mention a little bit ago about the Sons of Liberty, led by Sam Adams and John Hancock. They did the Boston Tea Party. They did Liberty Poles. They really hated tax collectors for Great Britain. One thing that they did to one tax collector was tar and feather him. So now we are moving on to the battles. The first battle is of Lexington and Concord. This is where Paul Revere did his famous ride. Lexington and Concord is where our first battles would be. So the British are trying to capture a couple of our main founding fathers, and this is where Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Sam Prescott make their rides to let it be known that the British are coming. The British are coming. All right, so you can see on this map here, they meet at the Old North Bridge, and what happens is 8 Minutemen end up dying. Nobody knows who really fired the first shot. Of course, we Americans are going to blame the British, and the British are going to blame us. So they move on to neighboring Concord, and this is where the shot heard around the world was that we fire back, and the Revolutionary War has officially started. So if you look here, we got all these events leading up to it, and you have all the colonial responses. Well, essentially what we get is war. Now, the Americans try to issue peace, but the king is pretty confident in his army that if the Americans want a war, then they can easily defeat us. So the Second Continental Congress issues the Olive Branch Petition, which is rejected by the king. So the Second Continental Congress names George Washington its commander-in-chief. He organizes the militia into an army. Then what you get is you get the Battle of Bunker Hill. Now this is one of the more important battles. However, America did lose, but it proved that we could fight. All right, America did lose, but it proved that we could fight. All right. Couple important people. You got Thomas Paine, writer of Common Sense, a book basically about, a small book pamphlet about why America should be free. A lot of the soldiers read it to keep their spirits up. Benjamin Franklin went over to France a few times to try to convince them to join our war effort. Abigail Adams, wife of John Adams, was a proponent of remembering the ladies and making sure that women got rights, although they really didn't when things, happened. France couldn't really join our war effort if we were still part of Great Britain, so we had to declare independence. And our Declaration of Independence essentially is a breakup letter letting Great Britain know that our relationship is over and we are done with them. It is a list of grievances and basically listing all the things wrong that King Henry and his parliament did against us. Signed by 55 people, official on July 4th, 1776. All right, this was treason, meaning we are going to war. Militia had some good, they had some bad. We were fighting on our home court. Obviously, that's home field advantage, makes it a little bit easier to do guerrilla warfare. However, they were untrained soldiers. They didn't have experience. Obviously, we didn't have enough money to pay them. Some troops wanted paid or they were going to desert. We didn't have a navy. We were low on supplies. However, again, we're fighting for our home. We're fighting to become independent, so we're going to fight a little bit harder. You should be familiar with loyalists, patriots, and neutrals. George Washington, again, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, gained fame in the French and Indian War as he fought for the British. Women even played a role, nurses and cooks mainly, and a few of them were even spies. All right, so women played a huge role. women that played as spies, one of the most famous was Molly Pitcher. Probably the most famous spy of the time was Nathan Hale, who actually ended up getting caught as he was a school teacher in a building with many children of British officers, and he said, "I regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." There was lots of battlegrounds, most of them up here in the north and northeast, some down in the south. The war is going to continue, and what happens is the British actually hire German mercenaries called Hessians. Now, we got a few turning points we're going to look at. The first is the Battle of Trenton. Now, during the winter months, normally the soldiers took time off and they just went to camp and tried to wait out winter. Well, George Washington wasn't having that. He wasn't doing that. So on Christmas, the night of Christmas, George Washington and his army crosses the Delaware River. This is a famous painting of that depiction. They cross the Delaware River, go into New Jersey, and this is where they surprise the Hessians and the British troops and defeat them at what we call the Battle of Trenton. The next important battle is the Battle of Saratoga. The colonial army is greatly outnumbered, and they go into this battle and end up winning. And what this does is this proves to France that the colonial army stands a chance, and as a result, France agrees to help the Americans in the war. Now, I mentioned winter camp. The worst winter during the Revolutionary War was the winter of 77 going into 78. And at one camp was Valley Forge, where many of our soldiers died as a result of either freezing to death or starving to death. We were low on supplies. It was really cold. It was really snowy. Soldiers didn't have a lot to do. They were just really, really cold and didn't have a lot of food. One of the things they could do was read a lot of books and train. Lafayette actually trained some of our troops here. And they read books like Common Sense and The Crisis. Common Sense, again, written by Thomas Paine. The Marquis de Lafayette was a French nobleman who gave his time and even his money to the American cause. He was good friends with George Washington. He was an important part of our spy network. He used his own money to pay our troops when they wanted to desert. John Paul Jones was the father of the American Navy, had his famous saying, "I have not yet begun to fight," when his ship was going down against one of the Britain's ships in battle. Battle of Yorktown is the final major battle of the American Revolution. This is where we put, so if you see right here at Yorktown, you got the American soldiers pressing this way, and then the French show up and start bombarding them. General Cornwallis, who was the leader of the British army, he surrenders to Washington at Yorktown. And the war is over. It's not officially over, but it is pretty much over. This would be the last major battle. It's not over until that was in 1781. It's not over until 1783 when both sides agreed to the Treaty of Paris. It ends the American Revolution. America gets all the lands east of the Mississippi, and they get their independence. So it kind of looks like this. In future months, we will talk about this land here as America begins to expand westward. We gained independence, all the land east of the Mississippi, all the redcoats were forced to leave, and the British were supposed to get, paid back the stuff that we stole or things that we owed them, but really Americans didn't pay them very much. All right, I know that was a quick review. You might want to watch it a couple times. It was only about 20 minutes, so I hope that helps.